G'day, welcome to Numbers chapters 19 and 20, Torah Tuesday. We come to a sad point in the story today. We're in the middle of a rebellion section in the book of Numbers. It's pretty devastating to read. Now, you might remember from the earlier chapters in Numbers that God told his people how they should organize themselves in the camp. The tribes around the outside, and then the Levites close to the tabernacle in the middle, and then the tabernacle in the middle. And Aaron and Moses were at the center of the Israelite community because that's where God was, and they were people who could go in and out of the tent. And what you might not have noticed in this rebellion section as we've been reading it so far is that the rebellion happens in those three locations. It begins in the tribes around the outside, and then it happens in chapter 16 amongst the Levites. And devastatingly today, we read about how rebellion finds its way right into the heart of the Israelite community. Moses and Aaron will be disobedient today. So let's have a look at chapter 20. First, as we read, we find out that the Israelites are in the desert of Zin, and it is the first month. Now, those are details you probably don't pay any attention to, but it's important to realize the desert of Zin is the place that the Israelite spies went out from back in chapter 13. So it's 7 chapters later, many stories have passed, but we're back in the same place. Which begs the question from us, how much time has passed since that episode in chapter 13? We're told that it is the first month, but it doesn't tell us what year it is, or how long they've been in the wilderness. We just don't know the answer to these questions at this point. But we are told that Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, has died. So enough time has passed that the wilderness generation are dying off, which is exactly what was meant to happen. And then at the end of the chapter, we read about the death of Aaron as well. So again, how long has it been? The question is in our mind. Well, we're actually going to find in the coming chapters that this is the first month of the 40th year in the wilderness. We're reaching the end of the wilderness generation at this point. 40 years they have spent wandering in the wilderness. And they've been going in circles for those 40 years. But the same tune is being played by the people. Have a look at verses 2 and 3 in chapter 20. It says, they have the same complaint that they've had the whole time. We have no water. Did you lead us out of Egypt to this horrible place? Why? It's exactly the same thing they actually said back in Exodus chapter 17, when they were only days out of Egypt. So for the last 40 years, they've just said the same complaints. They haven't changed their tune at all. And just back in Exodus chapter 17, God provides Moses and Aaron with a solution to the people's water problem. Now, it's actually when you compare these two stories, so you compare the account in Exodus chapter 17 with the account that we have here in Numbers chapter 20, that you really start to see what's going on in Numbers chapter 20. So we're going to talk and compare them as we go. Here, Numbers chapter 20, God says to Moses and Aaron, take your staff, gather the people together at the rock, and speak to the rock in front of the people, and it will pour forth water. Now notice that, so there's 3 steps. Take your staff, gather the people, speak to the rock. Now when you go back to Exodus chapter 17, God's instruction is, take your staff, gather the people at the rock, and strike the rock with your staff. Do you notice the difference? Numbers 20, he says, speak to the rock. Exodus 17, he said, strike the rock. Now, both times they're meant to take their staff, meant to gather the people, but there's a difference. Even though there's a difference, God's instructions are very clear to Moses. So let's see what Moses does. Verse 9, Moses took the staff, tick. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said, he gathered the assembly, tick. He said to them, to the people he speaks, rather than speaking to the rock. And what he says to the people is insightful. He says, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? And then Moses raised his arm and he struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out and the community and their livestock drank. Moses and Aaron did not do what God instructed them to do. They spoke to the people, not to the rock. Listen, you people, must we bring water out of this rock? And as a result of this, God says to Moses and Aaron with devastating brevity, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Dang. You did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. Now, the lack of trust that God's speaking about here, it's the same accusation that God levels against the Israelites back in chapter 14 when he sentences them to their death in the wilderness. Because what's happened here is that Moses and Aaron failed to obey God's command just like the people. And so God will give them the same fate as the people. They will die in the wilderness. Now, you might read this story and you might think that the consequence doesn't seem to be proportionate to the crime. They didn't do anything massively wrong. He just struck the rock rather than speaking to it. But you have to remember that these men, Moses and Aaron, are the men who had exclusive access into the most holy place. And based on this principle of proximity that we've heard about all the way through the Torah, being in God's holy place requires the highest level of holiness. And so, like God says to them, they failed to honor God as holy in the sight of the community. And so this is their fate. Now, keep in mind, this is the 40th year. It's the 40th year. Remember, God told Moses they would be in the wilderness 1 year for every day that the Israelites were spying on the land. So 40 days. Moses knows that the time in the wilderness is almost there. It's almost over. And yet, in the 40th year, Moses and Aaron are disobedient. So what's in this story for us? Now, put yourself in Moses' shoes for a moment. He delivered his people out of Egypt, through the Red Sea. He met with God at Sinai. He even delivered the law to them. He interceded on their behalf. He has just the most incredible CV. Without a doubt, one of the best CVs in all of history is Moses' CV. And yet, it is a small disobedience in his old age that disqualifies him from entering the promise. I think there is a warning in this for us. We can sometimes rest on our laurels, rest on the things of our former faith, what we've done. We retell the stories of what we once did for Jesus and what we once did for the kingdom and the wonderful things that we once did. And yet, if faithfulness is not enduring, then what value does it have? The question you need to ask is, what obedience are you demonstrating today? Today. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden his hearts as they did in the rebellion. This is what he's referring to. He says, see to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful and unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. He says, we come to share in Christ if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly until the end. That's the call that we have, to hold on firmly until the end. And we can learn that from Moses' devastating story. Father, humble us to trust you and honor you as holy, even as the finish line approaches.